Hi, I'm Mr. Miyagi and this is Mr. Miyagi's Workshop. Well, today we're back on that 360 CB360 motor. We're going to put it all back together again. We're going to focus on the transmission, put the crank in, hopefully get the lower case put on there and get it all torqued up. So, I know I haven't been online for a while. I've had other things I've had to take care of, like getting our garden in. It's that time of year again. So anyway, like I always say, let's get to it. Since we've got a little bit of that Ultimate Super Slicks on there installing, I want to install the shift drum first. Get that in place. And just before I do that, I'm going to show you something. Right here, this is like the neutral light makes contact. That's the little spot for indicating it when it's in neutral. So when you're installing this, you kind of want to put everything when they're in neutral. So there's your plug right down in here. So I just kind of line both of those up. And then this slides over. Now there's a little pin and everything that you need to put in there. You've taken this apart. Of course, the only way to get this all apart is take that pin out. We're going to go for this center slot. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get that down, that little pin down in that groove, this groove right in here. There it goes. And then there's a little keeper that keeps it in place. And that just slides in like that. All that does is hold that pin down. So this is all in there now. Now the next piece should be putting in is the other shift forks. And then these little go into the grooves there. So the first one goes in. That slides in. You want to go too far because you have the second fork you have to put in place. And all this slides together. Boom. Just like that. Now on the back side, to hold all this together, there's a little locking mechanism. So let's slide this around this way. So this is it, keeps everything pretty much in place. Also helps find, I believe it's neutral. So you have a steel ball, you have a locking plate with this little unit right here. And now there's a little O-ring that goes on there. Roll it down on there. So locking plate, then the O-ring, because it fits right in that little groove area there. We have a spring that we have to put in. That pushes against the ball bearing. And then everything just kind of screws down into place there. But you got to kind of play with that drum a little bit to make sure that everything slides into place. Now I don't want to put the lock pin up here in case I've done something wrong. I want to double check everything to make sure everything is right first. Grab a pair of pliers and shift this drum around. All right. Back into neutral. Neutral there. Get neutral there. So I want to place a little more Ultimate Slick on here. You can use any type of lubricant on there. They make all sorts, and whatever works for you. Also, might want to point out here is that there's 2 locating pins for the bearings on here. You should take these out. I forgot to, and luckily I was able to find them in my cleaning tank. I had to fish around through the gunk and everything, but I found both of them. This one I found earlier, and then I realized I needed another one on this side. So be aware of that. Those just slide in place and they just hook onto the bearings. Let me show you. There's a little spot right there for that bearing to go, that little pin to go into. And then they just drop into place there. Also, there's some keepers. You want to make sure that these are in place. Let me pull this back out a little bit here. And those just slide down in the grooves. There's only 2 halves. I guess that's all they figured they needed. So then that just drops in on a lot of the gearing here. And then you got to make sure that pin, that bearing on the pin drops into that little groove there. And same thing on this half groove. So now we can put the other one in place. So here again we want to put the half sleeve in. Goes down in there. And then we're going to line up on the forks, shifting forks. Everything just kind of drops into place. Now you may have to move these up and down a little bit. And there you go. And then everything will drop in. But here again, like I said, you want to make sure that you get those pins where they're supposed to be on these bearings. And that's pretty much it on the tranny, on putting it back together again, except you might want to, like what I'm going to do here, I'm going to lubricate the fork area where they slide. Of course, you can check gearing and everything. You can grab your drum with a pair of pliers. You can see that everything is moving. So that's first gear. That's neutral. Sometimes these won't shift. Okay, there's second. There's third. There's fourth, fifth. And I believe that's 6th gear right there. So, alrighty. So let's slide this all back down into neutral. Sometimes you have to spin the gears now, so these things will shift proper. All right. And neutral. I hope I made that clear for everybody. So I have these seals here that should go in at this, and it's much easier to put these in place while the motor is apart. Oh. Okay, so this is the push rod seal for the clutch. Let me get that down in there. And before we slide this in place, put a little lubricant on there. Spin this over. Okay, so this has a little lock on that seal. So when this slides on, you may have to lift that gear cluster up. But that slides on there and then rotates down into a slot on this side. I don't know if you can make that up, but there's a slot right in there that has to sit. So I think now I'm going to move on to putting the crank in. Okay, this crankshaft isn't too bad to set up. This just slides down in there. Excuse me, this bearing here also has a keeper spot on it. There's a little pin located right there. So that has to drop down on there. Plus, I'm going to try to get that. Where's that at? Get that click in. And then these two inner bearings have these little slots that they fit in on the journals right there. Those pop in, and that's where they go. So now your crank is pretty much put together. Pretty simple. You also kind of want to have your timing chain on at that period of time too. Makes it a lot easier to put this thing together. One other thing, before I forget, we need to put in the lower part of the timing chain adjuster. So I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant on there for the shaft, and then that drops into place right there. We're going to need to put this timing chain plunger in. You want to make sure that that flat part is up, so when that bolt goes in, this bolt, when it ends up happening, is that catches that flat area and holds that in place for your tensioning. So we're going to slide this down in the hole, and I'm going to put this screw in. And one of the major things you got to do is you got to push that down in there. And I found the easiest way is if you have a big pair of channel locks, you can just squeeze that down in there and then tighten up your screw. You run that down to a touch, just back it off a little bit, and then you can squeeze this together. Let me move this plug. We have a lower plug that needs to be put back in place too, but I don't know, this seemed to work fairly well for me. And I can just run that in, and we can tighten down that 10 millimeter. That will hold that plunger in place for right now. So now we can put this case all back together now. So make sure that's in. Don't forget to put the bottom plug here. It goes right in that area there. Put that in. And we'll tighten this all up after we get the motor together. Also at this time, you want to put in the shift shaft seal. It goes for the shaft here. I just slip it in place and then use, this is a 19 millimeter socket, and just tap it down in there. So now it's down in place. Also at this time too is we also need to put in the kickstart mechanism. Okay, I finally got the kickstart in. I'm dealing with some customers, and in between all this I didn't get a lot of the filming done, but the whole thing is that you need to get this dog on the kickstart right here, and then there's another little dog on this shifter here when you see it, that needs to all go together, and you got to squeeze this all together and put that snap ring in place. It can be a bit of a bear. If you don't have to remove this when you take the engine apart, I wouldn't. I fought this thing for about 15 minutes until I got the right system down, but it does work. When you know you've got it right, you can spin this gear, the kick gear inside there, and let me see if I can get this mechanism to work. So as it comes down, as the kick comes down, it drives this locker gear in place, which turns the gear inside the engine here and makes everything turn over. So anyway, now we're at this stage here. I'm going to finish doing a little bit of cleanup that I see that needs to be done, and I also need to put in the splash plates for in here. Well, at this stage we can put these splash shields in. They just basically drop in there. And then we have a catch. So this little catch slides in. I'm trying to remember which way. Slides in and hooks on this side. Push down on these shields. And then that'll slide through. You just got to push down on them. And then what that will do, that little cutaway area will, once I get everything lined up here, push it down a little bit. And then that will lock in on this side over here and hold those little splash guards down in place. What I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to lay some goop on here, and we'll get this ready to seal to set on to the main case. One thing you want to do too before you put these cases together is you want to put a little dab of the sealant along the seal area. Just helps hold all this and make sure it doesn't leak. So we just put a little bit up in there. Okay, I ran into a bit of a problem. I did not push this plunger all the way in as far as it would go because it was pushing against the crank and I couldn't turn the crank. It wouldn't turn. So that's one thing you want to check when you snug these down, just to make sure you've gotten everything where it needs to be. So I'll go ahead and put this back on there again. Yeah, even I make mistakes too. But you want to tighten that down, make sure it's up there. I'm getting a good turn over there. So I'm going to put all the bolts back in, and then I'm going to snug everything down again and double check. Worst case scenario, you have to pull them apart. So you do a crisscross pattern when tightening these. We're just going to run it down snug. See what we got here. Oh yeah, that's much better. Okay, I'm going to torque the main bolts down here, the 8, to 15 pounds. And of course we'll come back and check them after we've done all the bolts. We'll go through and do a check just to make sure it is what it should be. Okay, so these have been set at 15. I'm going to go through and torque smaller bolts at 7, and then we'll re-torque again. So here we go. And you don't want to forget that we have this other one on the top side that needs to be torqued. So I'm going to let this all sit now for a little bit, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to 1 pound it a little higher. So this will go from 15 to 16, and these will go from 7 to 8 pounds. Okay, I'm going to work on this little shift dog. What this basically does is lock the shifting drum into place. So I'm going to hit this up on there, and I've kind of put everything together, and then I slide it down into place, and then I will crank this in. I want to make sure that that slides down. That there's a little step in the stand that you need to make sure that it slides over. This will torque at 7. So now we can put the shifter pong in place, which will go in through here and then drop out the other side. So now this just slides down in there, goes through the seal. Now this comes up, you hold that up, and you want to make sure that you get these over that one little stud that hangs up. This drops down in there, and now your shifter is basically all set up in place. So we can work on putting all of this together. Next is I'm going to get the oil pump and get that all going. I might point out here is that this is the oil pump sump screen, and you want to make sure that these are cleaned really well, because they do help tremendously to stopping particles, large particles, from going through your system. So I don't know if you can make that out. This is a little dirty. I'm going to go over there and clean that, and I'm going to double check the oil pump. And when you're cleaning these out, if you use air, make sure you blow from this side, not the outside, the inside, because this is where the particles are getting sucked in this way, so it helps relieve them just to shove them back out again. So this is good and clean. I'm going to go put this on the little sump. These feet go this way on your sump, so otherwise that sump won't fit in there. You have to put them on this way, and be careful with this. This can be brittle, so when you're working that back onto your little sump pickup here, the feet go towards the back of the sump, and just walk it on there. You got to work at it a little bit. So there's 3 screws that hold this together. Pull these apart and check them. You also want to make sure that you have the proper gasket for that, and it's a real paper thin gasket. It has to go back on here. So this is over there. Pull this center out. And you just kind of want to inspect it. This isn't bad. I've seen a lot worse. And then that slides out of there. You also want to look to see if there's any cracks, kind of like in this area where it's cracked through. If that's the case, I cleaned the surface of the oil pump with a razor blade, and then found I had a piece of glass, and I put some of my sandpaper 400 grit on there, and just went around it, lubricated it with some WD, just to make sure it was all good and clean, and got it all surfaced up a little bit. So now we can put this back together again. So that just basically drops in. But I think what I want to do is, here again, put some lubricant in that, because you got to remember this pump is going to be starting dry in a sense. Here we go. You want to kind of get that lined up on the hole there, because when this comes in, it has to line up on this flat shaft here. So we'll drop that in, and then we want our gasket to line up. These have to line up with the slots, and then I'm going to put this cap piece back on, and then there's little grooves that these fit in on either side of that. You just have to kind of work your way on there. Make sure you got it on the right way, and this will just set down. Pull that up just a little bit so everything can get kind of lined back up. As I've said in the past before, it's just not to get in a hurry when you're doing this stuff. Just take your time. There we go. All right, it's good and torqued and ready to rock and roll. Pulled off the old O-rings, and I'm going to put new ones on. And I believe I'm going to put a new one on here too. It came with my kit, my rebuild kit, so I'm going to replace it. Now I put a little bit of lubricant on these where the O-rings go for the oil pump, just because there's a little indents that these sit in. All right, so now the oil pump, we have these spots here that are the in and out take, and they have to line up on these holes. And then that sits down in there, and you got to work them down into place without losing the O-rings out of their spot. And then that sits down in there. Now we have the screen, the sump, That has to go into place. And it's always a good idea to put a little bit of lubricant on that. Then that'll slide down in there, work it in. And then now all we got to do is put the screws in. All right, we're just going to tighten up these screws. And then we finish up tightening down the sump bolts. All right, so we're ready to move on to the clutch housing. Okay, we're at the stage now that we're putting the pump drive on. This shaft goes in there. There's a little keeper's hole on it where it just drops into place. Need to install the crankshaft gear, which helps drive everything. Clutch housing can go over and slide on in place. That all dries it. So now you're all set together, your pump and all that's good to go. And you can set your oil filter in place. We also need to put the snap ring on the clutch housing. Snaps down in place there. I'm going to put everything on here. Now there's a flat washer that goes in there. It's not actually, it says outside. So that goes, it's got kind of a taper to it. So it's got kind of a spring set up. And they slide over and drop down. And then you have a nut, a special nut. And you have to have the special driver. It's better off to buy the driver. It's not all that much. You can use it on other items on the bike. Trying to do it with a punch or anything can bung up that nut there fairly easy. So we're going to tighten this up. All right, that's locked in place. Down inside there's some tabs that you can line up those little grooves in that nut so that it doesn't back off. And it's just a simple thing of taking the tab and pushing it up into the slot. Of course, putting clutch plates in, you know, it's just fiber and then the metal plate and a fiber and a metal plate. One of the other things you need to put in here is you need to put the center push. And what that does is your push rod that comes from the other side pushes that up, pushes this open, so then it loosens up all your clutches. Now I'm going to put the springs in. They just drop into place. Spring bolts in. Tighten these down. I'm just going to go gradually around them. All right, so those are in place. I want to put my oil filter back together again. So I need the O-ring that goes around this. Now, this is the old O-ring, but I was able to go to Napa and I went through their little O-ring collection and found one that fits perfectly. Now, if you get a rebuild kit or a gasket set, you can get, they usually come with it. So we need to put our snap ring in. And then here again, I want to make sure that this is set in place. Good to go. So this side is pretty much complete except for having cover on. Down on. So now I just got to do is put the side screws on and good to go here. So we've got the other side done, so I thought I'd work on this side. I'm going to put the clutch rod back in. So I'm not running this one with a starter, kick only, but I'm going to go ahead and put the stuff back on there just in case I do change my mind and put a starter on it. One thing I like to do on these keys is to just make them a little bit tighter in there. Taking one of these little punches and putting just a little nick on there tightens them up nicely so it doesn't move around while you're trying to put this all back together again. Another thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the shaft is good and clean. Use a little cleaner on a rag here and we'll wipe this down. Just want to very easily set this on, line up your key. There we go. Just got to play with that a little bit. And we'll put our locker in. All right, well, it's the next day and I've got the pistons on in place. I put the engine on a stand so it'd be a little easier to do the cylinders, the pistons and cylinders and head. So anyway, one of the major things that you want to look out for is you want to put these O-rings on that come in your kit. That helps seal everything up on the cylinder itself. Another thing that I like to do is I like to squirt a little WD down inside these just to make it go on, and I think the WD helps break in the rings in a little faster. Another thing that I've got going on here too is I made up a little unit like this that slides in between that helps hold that piston in place. So we'll bring it down on there when you're setting these cylinders on. You also want to make sure that you've got your dowel pins in and have your base gasket on, so this will slide down on there. Right at this point too, I like to reach in and grab the timing chain. Now I got a spot above it with a string that'll hold that all in place while I put this piston in the cylinder. Now what I do here is I basically end up feeding that in there and then working those rings so that I can get this to come down on there. And I just kind of basically shove that piston in there, working those rings so that they slide in the hole. So now if that piston's held in place, it's not going to go anywhere, so I can work the other piston rings together. I find too rocking sometimes helps get these down there, down in place. Also, one thing you want to keep in mind, there are 4 of these dowels that go in here. The back ones have a seal that go on there because this is actually a passageway, an oil passageway for oil to get to the upper end. So you want to make sure that these seals are on there, otherwise you could have a leak. So when this gets compressed, everything will tighten up on it. So now we're at the stage we can put the head on. One thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to feed that chain back up through, the timing chain. So I've got my keeper on it. All right, we'll hook that up on my string up above so it holds everything in place. There we go. So now I got to put my nuts on there. I've got washers that I have to put in place. One thing you want to be careful though is put something down inside so you don't drop those washers or the nuts down inside the engine. So those just slip on there, these flat washers. Another little easy trick is that if you want to get everything lined up, you can put a screwdriver there. So all I'm doing is I'm slipping that screwdriver and I'm putting it on the top of the stud coming through. Put these nuts on. So we're just going to run these down till they touch. One thing you really want to remember is you got to put these small bolts that tie the head together. So I'm going to tighten this head down, and I'm going to do it in a couple of different stages. In reality, this all ends up at 25 pounds torque on here, but I'm going to do it in 3 steps to get it there. And then the outside ones are set at, I believe, 8 pounds. So right now I'm going to do this right here, and we're going to start off with a crisscross pattern. So what I'm going to start out with is I'm going to probably run this up 15 pounds first. So that's set at 15. I'm going to hold off on tightening these until we do the last setup here. So I'm going to let this sit for a little bit, kind of everything mellow out. And then we will take it up to 20 pounds, 18, 20 pounds, and then we'll do the final one at 25. All right, so let's move on to the final stage at 25 pounds. We will also let that sit for a bit, and then I'll go back and just check it at 25. So I'm going to do these outside ones. All right. 8 pounds. So I'm going to get my cam and everything and get this all set up to put the cam in place. So this can get a little tricky here. We need to put this cam in there. Oh, another thing is to make sure that little spacer shim is on there for the cam. So this is going to come through, and then we feed everything. You just got to walk all this stuff on there. There we go. So we can put this chain on. But first, I'm going to get everything set to go. One thing you want to make sure is that when you're timing this is that this little pin on the end of the cam is on the top. And I want to set this engine at top dead on the left bank. Okay, so now I've got everything I've got the crank on the LT mark, and we verified that we are at top dead center with the left bank, left mark, and I'll show a little picture here. And then we're going to line up these marks. You have to move the chain around a little bit to get these marks lined up with this flat area. Then you're in time. Then you can put your bolt in, your cam bolt. Be very careful you do not drop that down in the engine. It makes for a really bad day. So I'm going to snug that up a little bit. Now I'm going to rock this over and put the other screw in or bolt in for the cam. And you want to torque these bolts to 15 foot-pounds, between 13 and 15. I torqued mine at 15 here, so we're good to go on there. Now we can put in the chain tensioners. What that will do also will change the angle of these a little bit. So you'll think that you're off, but with the tensioners out and you're setting the everything in place, these should line up. Let me get this back on where I was. There we go. Top dead center again. Everything's good to go. Yep. Alrighty. So let's put the chain tensioners in. I've got the front one here. And you don't have to do this, but I like to lubricate these things just a little bit when I'm setting them down in there. And they just drop down. And they drop in a little catch down in there. The front one does. The back one's a little different. This one here is a little different. Want to make sure everything is good. And like I said, I'm going to do a little bit. You don't have to do this, but that's just me. So this just drops down. You'll feel it drop in. If it's sitting on the edge like that, you're pretty darn close to where it needs to be. And then the upper mount needs to be put in place. There we go. So that just slides on there. And everything just kind of lines up. All right. So we just get the screws started in here, little bolts, and then we'll tighten it down. And then both of these need to be tightened to, what was it? 5 to 8 pounds. So let's set it at 5. Let's set it at 7 pounds. All right. So that's good to go right there. Also, you know, you can set cam chain tension on this because everything is basically in limbo. There's no pushing down on the valves. The chain's going to be fine. So you could, if you wanted to, loosen off your cam chain tensioner here, unloosen it, and then tighten it back up again. And then there's one process you don't have to do later on. So the top can be put back on the rocker box. So you want to make sure all your areas are clean here. If you want to at this time too, is you can lubricate these areas a little more. So I like to put a good dab even on the cam itself. Oh, and one thing that we need to do right now that I should have done a little earlier is put the cam chain seal in place. I've just pushed the cam chain seal in there, so this is good at this stage. So I'm going to set up the rocker box, and then we'll put it on. One of the things I did is I added 2 layers of furnace tape to this center journal, which is a tough one. What that does is it gives it about 6/1000 clearance, so it gets more oil up there to lubricate. And it's just this furnace tape that I'm using. And I use an X-Acto knife to cut all this, cut it out. And then once this is torqued down, these are the last 2 that you torque down, and you just run them down snug, and it just allows more oil to hit in onto this center journal. Okay, I've got the sealant on. I also put a couple of dabs right by the seal there. So when this rocker box goes on, you actually get a good seal in that area. So we'll set her down on there. Oh yeah, and I've also backed off the rockers so that it'll screw down a little better. Let me back this other one off just a hair more. The 2 with flat washers or sealing washers go on the inside, and then we have these go down here. Okay, I'm going to torque these to 15 pounds. And in these smaller ones, I'm going to 8 pounds. These inner cam ones, I want to tighten down to just that they are snug. So that's pretty much set, other than doing the valves, putting the point plate in and getting that all set. So that I won't do until we put it in the bike. I may do the valves beforehand. It'd be much easier to do them on the bench. Common-motors.com has several really good videos on valve adjustments and how to set your points. I don't want to get into it. They've done a wonderful job on doing it, so go over there. Plus, that's where I buy a lot of my parts. This pretty much wraps up the rebuild on the Junker 360 motor. You can see we've brought her back pretty much to life. Until we light her up, we won't know how good. But then we have to move over and start working on the frame and getting that set up. So if there's any questions or comments, you can put it in the comment section below, or you can send it to my email address at tmiyagi@hotmail.com. And if you've liked this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget that ringy-dingy button over there for the next episode coming up. So this is Mr. Miyagi saying, you be safe out there. Hope to see you on the road. Ciao.